In 1942, an American industrialist who had never built a warship in his entire life walked into a meeting with President Roosevelt and proposed something the United States Navy had genuinely never attempted before: building aircraft carriers the same way Henry Ford had once built automobiles, on an assembly line in enormous numbers, in a fraction of the time a conventional shipyard would ever need to complete even a single comparable vessel. Roosevelt approved 50 of them on the spot, a genuinely enormous commitment of wartime resources to a shipbuilder whose own previous experience involved cargo ships rather than anything resembling a genuine warship. Within 2 years, every single one existed, and Japanese admirals who had spent the previous decade believing aircraft carriers were among the most complex, most difficult warships any nation could possibly build were about to discover exactly how wrong that assumption actually was. This is the story of the Casablanca-class escort carriers, the 50 small aircraft carriers Kaiser shipbuilding produced at a pace no other nation on Earth could realistically match, and the specific night off the Philippine island of Samar, when a handful of those same supposedly disposable ships stood between a Japanese battle fleet and total disaster for the entire American invasion force gathered nearby. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the industries that made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Henry Kaiser had already made his own reputation building Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that kept Allied supply lines running across 2 entire oceans throughout the war, when he proposed applying that exact same assembly line philosophy to something the Navy had always treated as fundamentally too complex for rapid mass production: a genuine aircraft carrier capable of actually launching and recovering combat aircraft at sea. Kaiser's own shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, laid down the lead ship, USS Casablanca, in November of 1942 and commissioned her the following July, a genuinely rapid turnaround for a vessel type the rest of the American shipbuilding industry still generally treated as a multi-year undertaking. By the time the full order of 50 carriers was actually complete, in July of 1944, Kaiser's own yard had reached a production pace that genuinely stunned naval observers on every side of the war, a new escort carrier launching roughly every 10 days at the height of the program, an assembly line turning out warships with the kind of regularity most nations reserve for considerably smaller, considerably simpler vessels entirely. Before we get into the single night that actually proved these small carriers were worth every bit of that industrial effort, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The specific method Kaiser's own shipyards actually used to achieve that production pace borrowed directly from techniques already proven building Liberty ships, prefabricating entire sections of each hull separately across multiple different work areas simultaneously rather than building a single ship sequentially from keel to superstructure the way conventional shipyards had always operated. Welded rather than riveted construction, another Kaiser innovation already proven on cargo vessels, further accelerated the entire process, letting semi-skilled workers who had never built a ship before the war actually complete structural work considerably faster than traditional riveting crews could manage, using methods that had barely changed across the preceding several decades of American shipbuilding. That combination of prefabrication and welded construction meant Kaiser's own workforce, many of them women and workers with no prior shipbuilding experience, recruited specifically to meet wartime labor shortages, could actually match and eventually exceed the production speed of considerably more experienced traditional shipyards, working with a far smaller, far less specialized labor pool than Kaiser himself had assembled specifically for this exact project. Sailors serving aboard the Essex-class fleet carriers, the Navy's own larger, more heavily armored frontline ships, treated the smaller Casablanca-class with open derision almost from the moment the first examples actually entered service alongside their own considerably more prestigious vessels. They called them Jeep carriers, baby flat tops, and, less affectionately, Kaiser's coffins, a nickname reflecting genuine doubt about whether these thin-skinned, hastily built ships could actually survive real combat at all against a serious enemy naval force. The letter CVE, the Navy's own official designation for an escort carrier, reportedly earned their own sarcastic backronym among skeptical sailors, standing in the joke zone telling for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, a reputation these ships would spend the rest of the war slowly and then very suddenly overturning entirely once actual combat gave them the chance to prove exactly what they were capable of. That reputation collapsed almost overnight during the Battle off Samar in October of 1944, when a small American task unit known as Taffy 3, built around 6 escort carriers and their own modest destroyer Escort, found itself directly in the path of a Japanese battle fleet built around 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed by any navy in the entire world, and nearly 20 additional cruisers and destroyers bearing down on a force that had never been designed to face anything resembling this kind of firepower. Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita's own force had emerged unexpectedly from behind an island, catching the American escort carriers with nothing standing between them and a fleet, many times their own combined firepower, in a genuinely terrifying tactical surprise nobody on the American side had actually anticipated that specific morning. The escort carriers themselves carried aircraft armed primarily for anti-submarine patrol and close air support, not the kind of heavy anti-ship ordnance the situation actually demanded, and the destroyers and destroyer escorts protecting them carried nothing close to the firepower needed to seriously threaten a battleship under any conventional understanding of naval warfare available at the time. What happened next became one of the most celebrated last stands in the entire history of the United States Navy, an engagement veterans of the battle would spend the rest of their own lives describing in genuinely reverent detail. American destroyers charged directly at the Japanese battle line, launching torpedo attacks against ships many times their own size, specifically to buy time for the escort carriers to actually escape the immediate threat, while aircraft from the carriers themselves flew repeated attack runs, some pilots making dry passes with empty weapons racks purely to force Japanese ships to take evasive action and disrupt their own gunnery, even after every actual bomb and torpedo had already been expended in earlier attack runs. The combined chaos, aggression, and sheer unexpected resistance from a force Kurita's own intelligence had almost certainly underestimated proved genuinely disorienting to the Japanese admiral, who ultimately made the decision to withdraw his own considerably more powerful fleet rather than continue pressing an attack against resistance this determined and this unexpectedly aggressive, a decision that likely saved the entire American invasion force at Leyte from a genuinely catastrophic naval bombardment that could have cost thousands of additional American lives. American forces sank 3 Japanese cruisers during the engagement, and USS Gambier Bay went down under direct naval gunfire, the only American aircraft carrier ever actually sunk by an enemy ship's own guns during the entire war, a genuine cost paid for a delaying action that ultimately accomplished exactly what it needed to. Fleet Admiral Ernest King, the most senior officer in the entire United States Navy, wrote directly to Henry Kaiser himself the following February, thanking him personally for the escort carrier's own battle performance and specifically referencing the dismissive nickname sailors had once used against Kaiser's own ships throughout the earlier years of the war. Mere jeep carriers indeed, King wrote, a short, almost wry line from the Navy's own top admiral that captured exactly how completely the small ship's own reputation had actually reversed itself in barely a single year of combat service, a genuine acknowledgement from the very top of the naval command structure that the ships once mocked as disposable had proven themselves considerably more valuable than that same mockery had ever actually anticipated. The human cost of the engagement off Samar deserves its own genuine acknowledgement rather than remaining buried beneath the broader story of industrial triumph and tactical success. USS Gambier Bay took direct hits from Japanese naval gunfire that eventually forced her own crew to abandon ship, sailors spending hours in open water before rescue actually arrived, a genuinely harrowing experience for men who had, only hours earlier, been flying routine anti-submarine patrols rather than fighting for their own survival against the largest battleship ever built. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, a considerably smaller and less heavily armed vessel than even the destroyers accompanying Taffy 3, charged directly into the Japanese formation and fought until she had literally exhausted her own ammunition supply, earning a reputation among naval historians as one of the most aggressively fought small ship actions of the entire war, before finally succumbing to the overwhelming firepower she had spent the engagement charging directly into. That combination of genuine sacrifice alongside genuine tactical success is precisely what makes Samar such a frequently studied engagement at American naval institutions today, a case study in how determined resistance from a genuinely outmatched force can still meaningfully alter an enemy commander's own battlefield decision-making. The escort carrier's own contribution to the war extended considerably beyond that single dramatic engagement off Samar, a detail sometimes lost given how thoroughly that specific battle has come to dominate the class's own wartime reputation. Casablanca-class carriers provided genuinely essential air cover for American amphibious landings across the Pacific, including the invasions of Saipan and Iwo Jima, freeing the larger, considerably more valuable Essex-class fleet carriers to actually hunt the Japanese Navy's own remaining carrier and battleship forces, rather than spending their own limited numbers on the comparatively routine work of supporting ground troops during an amphibious assault. Several examples also served in the Atlantic theater, escorting merchant convoys and hunting German submarines using exactly the kind of anti-submarine aircraft the class had originally been designed to carry before Samar ever demonstrated what these same ships could accomplish in a genuine surface combat role nobody had originally expected them to actually face. This is not a story about small ships simply getting lucky against overwhelming odds, since the specific combination of Kaiser's own industrial production speed and the raw courage of the sailors and pilots actually crewing these ships at Samar represented two entirely separate achievements that happened to intersect at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place. It is a story about how completely American industrial capacity could reshape naval warfare through sheer volume alone. 50 aircraft carriers built in roughly 2 years by a shipbuilder who had never built one before, ships derided as disposable right up until the exact night they proved considerably more valuable than anyone on either side of the war had ever actually expected them to be capable of achieving. Admiral Kurita's own post-war accounts of his decision to withdraw reveal a commander genuinely uncertain about exactly what he had actually encountered that morning, a confusion the escort carrier's own aggressive response had deliberately amplified rather than allowed to resolve in Japan's own favor. Some Japanese officers aboard Kurita's own flagship reportedly believed, at least initially, that the small task unit they had stumbled upon might actually represent a considerably larger American fleet carrier group, an understandable misjudgment given how aggressively both the carrier aircraft and the escorting destroyers had actually fought rather than simply attempting to flee the engagement entirely, as a genuinely outmatched force might reasonably have been expected to do. That uncertainty, combined with mounting Japanese losses to determined air and torpedo attacks, growing fuel concerns after a long approach through contested waters, and Kurita's own awareness that continued fighting risked exposing his fleet to additional American air power from elsewhere in the theater, ultimately proved decisive in his own choice to break off the engagement entirely rather than press forward into Leyte Gulf itself, where the actual American invasion fleet and its own considerably more vulnerable transport ships were still actively unloading troops and supplies onto the beaches. Kaiser's own broader production philosophy, prefabrication, welded construction, and a deliberately de-skilled assembly line approach that let inexperienced workers actually build genuinely complex vessels through carefully divided, repeatable tasks, went on to influence American shipbuilding practices for decades after the war itself had already ended. Several surviving Casablanca-class hulls found genuine second careers after 1945, converted into helicopter carriers, aircraft transports, and cargo vessels rather than simply scrapped outright, a testament to how fundamentally sound the underlying hull design actually proved to be, despite the rushed wartime circumstances of its own original construction under intense production pressure. USS Thetis Bay, one of the class's own surviving examples, went on to serve as one of the Navy's first dedicated helicopter assault ships during the following decade, a genuinely different role from anything her own original wartime designers had specifically anticipated when they first drew up the Casablanca-class blueprint back in 1942, proof that the underlying hull's own basic versatility extended well beyond the specific wartime mission it had originally been built to fulfill. Modern naval historians studying the broader question of how nations actually win prolonged industrial wars still regularly cite the Casablanca program specifically as one of the clearest documented examples of raw manufacturing capacity translating directly into genuine battlefield outcomes, a lesson considerably more concrete than most abstract discussions of industrial capacity manage to actually demonstrate through a single, specific engagement. If you want more stories about the ships nobody respected until the night they actually had to prove themselves, subscribe, and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.